Hello, it's Mike, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking to you about the room temperature mod function on the Vaillant ecoTEC Plus combination boiler with outdoor compensation. Hopefully, I will be able to answer the following questions for you. Which room temperature mod is the best? Which one is the most efficient? And which one saves you the most money? The last question is probably the most important. You can find the setting for the room temperature mod on the hamburger menu on the sensoCOMFORT. You have to press that menu twice and then go down to settings, select installer level, the code is 00, installation configuration, circuit 1, and then near the bottom you'll find room temperature mod. In room temperature mod there are three settings and I'll explain what they are. By default, room temperature mod is set to inactive. Inactive, the system operates purely on weather compensation, ignoring the room temperature sensor. The flow temperature is determined solely by the outdoor temperature and the heating curve, making the room thermostat a display-only device. I've explained heating curves in great detail in a previous video, and I'll add a link to the description. It's definitely worth your while having a look at that video to understand how heating curves work and how they affect the flow temperature. Alternatively, have a look at page 8 in the manual, where they explain in more detail with a desired temperature of 20 degrees Celsius. The manual is a bit of a mixed bag with confusing terms and poor examples. Active. This combines the outdoor temperature or weather compensation with the indoor temperature. If the indoor temperature deviates from the desired temperature, the system adjusts the flow temperature to compensate. For example, if the indoor temperature is colder than the desired temperature, it increases the flow temperature to maintain comfort. However, it does not completely deactivate heating if the room exceeds the desired temperature. Expanded. This is similar to active mode, but it adds an on-off thermostat-like functionality. If the indoor temperature exceeds the desired temperature by 0.125 degrees, heating is paused until it drops 0.188 degrees below the desired temperature. This mode is more responsive and may lead to frequent cycling, which can reduce efficiency in systems like heating pumps. This is what the manual says. And no, in my tests on my smart boiler, I'm finding the cycling is a lot less in expanded mode than active or inactive. All three modes, despite what the manual says, uses the heat curves. In my previous videos, I mentioned that I was testing inactive mode and active mode, and I've had mixed results, and I'll show you what I mean. The ultimate goal, though, is to have the most efficient smart combination boiler with the least amount of money spent on gas, while at the same time being comfortable in your home with the heating. So knowing which heat curve you are meant to be on and what room temperature mod setting you should have will determine this outcome. I've also mentioned that the golden rule of this particular smart boiler is to not fiddle, because fiddling with multiple settings can have huge consequences on the output of the smart boiler, and I'm going to show you exactly what I mean by these statements. As you can see, I'm using Home Assistant to understand what is happening with my smart boiler. The My Vaillant app that comes with the sensoCOMFORT is unfortunately too basic. It's okay for setting the weekly timer and the heat curve if you're prepared to click through the multiple menus. But it's useless when it comes to monitoring or comparing key fields such as current flow, indoor, outdoor, or desired or set back temperature. Not only that, I cannot see a history of the heat-in circuit or the status. All these comparisons can be done easily in Home Assistant. As mentioned earlier, I was testing Room Temp Mod set to inactive mode. And as much as I love the idea of relying solely on the weather compensation to determine the current flow temperature, this mode is not ideal for a number of reasons. The main reason is if you don't know which heat curve you're meant to be on. With the temperature outdoors fluctuating on an hourly basis and the flow control temperature moving depending on which heat curve you're on, if you're not reaching the desired temperature, so for example, in this graph, it's 20 degrees. Now, if you've got something other than 20 degrees, let's say 19 or 21, the manual doesn't offer you any help. I mean, you can kind of work it out. It's very difficult. You can also refer to the app, and I'll show you the frustration with this app in that if you go into the heating curve, the chart or graph that it's using is very similar to the manual, and it's using the desired temperature of 20 as the example. Now you can make changes to the heat curve here depending on which one you want to choose, but it's not reflecting your desired temperature. Now if I look at my timer under heating, weekly planner, you can see I have two timers set for the day, one at 5:30 to 11 and one at 5 to 11. And I'm wanting a desired temperature of 19. Now, if I go back to the heat curve doesn't reflect the 19 that I want. It's showing a heat curve of 20, likewise the manual. So knowing which heat curve to be on is tricky because the numbers that you see on this heat curve are not for your desired temperature. So that's the confusion. And in the early days, say 1 month after the boiler was installed, I was making a lot of changes to, say, the desired or the setback temperature, the heat curve, and all these variables play a big part in determining what the flow temperature is. And the flow temperature obviously is working off the outdoor temperature if you are set to inactive. And it's just extremely confusing. And when the temperature is dipping down to close to zero, and all you are trying to achieve is warming your house, if you're not warming your house, you're going to make a lot of changes. And changes on a regular basis is not a good thing for this type of boiler because any change takes a couple of hours or even a couple of days to reflect correctly, which is why I had to revert to using Home Assistant to monitor what was going on in the boiler. Unfortunately, Home Assistant only gives me the last 10 to 12 days. So you can see today's date, the 29th, and I can go back as far as the 20th. Now, at this time, I was on active mode. Now, active mode makes use of the outdoor temperature and the heat curve, obviously, and the indoor temperature, and it determines the flow temperature. So if it cools down indoors, then the flow temperature will increase, and it does this accordingly. There's only one day on this chart in the last 10 days where I set the room temperature mod set to active. All the other days that you see here, the room temperature mod is actually set to expanded, and that's what I've found to be the most efficient for my home. Now, on this particular day, the 21st, and you can see here, I was still fiddling around with the heat curve because I wasn't sure which heat curve I should be on at this point in time. And I was fiddling with the desired and the setback temperature. And on one particular day, I dropped the setback temperature. Slightly confusing. There's two fields in one year. It's seen as one field in Home Assistant. When it peaks, it's the desired temperature or target room temperature. And when it's outside of the timer, it drops back down to the setback temperature. So that's why you see two names there. But talking about this particular day, after fiddling around with the heat curve and not really figuring it out, I set the room temperature mod back to active. And what you can see on this day is that the temperature met the desired temperature and it actually went over. So let me just switch off this. You can actually see the yellow line is the indoor temperature. The green line where it's peaking is the desired temperature, and the room temperature actually went over the desired temperature, which is great. That means you're on the right heat curve, but with active, it doesn't know how to switch off. it just carries on getting warmer and warmer like it did over there. During that second timer mode, it went over the desired temperature and it just carried on going until the timer mode was, well, what was out of the timer mode, and then obviously it started dropping off like it should. So that's active. Another thing to notice with active is that the boiler doesn't switch off. And that's what it says in the manual. It just stays on and it's active. And you can see this by the circuit state um, graph. It's active for 24 hours, literally. Now, obviously, if it's on the whole time and there's a flow, you can see it's moving up and down. So it's actually doing a lot of cycles here in active mode, which is not what the manual says. It says expanded, there's a lot of cycles, but it's on the whole time. And I didn't like the fact that it was on the whole time, because when it's on the whole time, it's actually using more gas. And as a result, when it's on the whole time, it'll be more expensive. And I'll show you this shortly. So I switched it off room temperature mod on active. I changed it to expanded. And what expanded does, and you can see this in all of these days going forward, during expanded, the peak, it rises up to a target flow temperature that is determined by the heat curve. So I'm on a heat curve here of 1.3. So depending on the heat curve and the outdoor temperature, because that's how it works, if the outdoor temperature is low, the current flow temperature will be high. It'll be higher because the temperature is lower. You can see it also where the temperature has increased. So for example, yeah, it's gone up to 6. And here is the peak. Well, look at the difference. The current flow temperature peaks at 42 degrees, a lot lower than that because it was colder. Let me show you a chart that I did. The problem with this chart is it's quite detailed, but I'll show you exactly what the end goal is here, and that is it more expensive? Let's answer one of those questions. Which room temperature mod saves you the most money? Well, if you look at this row here, these 2 days I was fiddling around with well, I was first on active and then I was on expanded, but I was also fiddling around with the desired temperature and the setback temperature. You can see this because this little green line, the distance from the top to the bottom, is a lot smaller than, say, these days where it's a lot higher. I changed it a couple of days ago. I've lowered the desired temperature to 19, whereas these days were 20. And I did that because I wanted to figure out for once and for all which heat curve I needed to be on. So the only way I could do that is set the desired temperature to 20 to match those charts that are, yeah, because this is showing a 20. And then I was going to try and closely monitor if I was reaching the current flow temperature based on the outdoor temperature. So that's why I had it set to 20. But with expanded, you can clearly see when it's freezing cold outside, like it was here, 2.5, and the peak is when the timer is on, you can see the flow temperature is high, 54 degrees. So 54 degrees, and that's set to 20, and the outdoor temperature is 2. So now if we go to the chart, 2 is there. I'm on a 1.3, so this sucks a little bit because there's no line in the example for 1.3, but 1.3 is just above 1.2. So if I go down and I keep going, so here is 2, around about here. So in this vicinity, I'm assuming that's just above 54, 55. And that's what you can see in this chart. Look here, there it goes, 53. So it's somewhere there, 53, 54 for that particular temperature. So that gave me a lot of faith because now I know that 1.3, it might be a little higher. It could be 1.4, but 1.3 is showing me consistent results. And I'll use another example. You can see the outdoor temperature here is 9.6. So let's just round that off to 10. And yeah, during the peak temperature is 47. So again, 10:47. I'm on a 1.3, which is above this 1.2 line. It was 10. So we keep going down, we keep going down, keep going down. Are we on the same line? And it's confusing because you can't really see the line. So it's around about this vicinity here. So let's say 40, I don't know, below 40 to 45. And what did I say? We're right over here. If I go in there and I go up, that's in the timer, and we go up here and look, 42.5. It's in that vicinity. So I know that the curve that I've got here is matching what the current flow temperature is based on the outdoor temperature. The other thing about expanded is this idea that it switches off. It actually says in the manual it works like a thermostat on off. And you can see that when it's outside of the timer, you see the current flow temperature starts dropping off. Look, it's dropping, dropping, dropping. And at that point in time, the boiler is actually off. And I can tell that because I've got this field called heating circuit. And here you can see it's heating and it's in line with the peak, and it's in line with the desired peak. That's during the timer. But now when it's outside of the timer, so this area over here, if I go back up this little portion, the status is saying idle and the blue is saying standby, and that means the boiler is off. And now look at the difference between day 21 and all the other days. You can actually see when I've got the timers set, when it's coming on, when it's going off, when it's coming on, when it's going off. You can also see it peaking when it's freezing cold outside and dropping the flow when the temperature is higher. For me personally, this setup is a lot better, and it reflects in the price. That one day when it was active, even though the temperature was, I don't know, below 5, look how much more money it used. I mean, okay, we're talking pence here, but still, over time, imagine if every single day is around a £6, or, and it's actually more than that because I've been keeping tabs in a spreadsheet, as one does. Look at all of these prices, and then look at the expanded prices. The expanded are all in the threes. There's even a £2.56, a £3, a £4.88, but it doesn't really get any higher than that. Now, the 20th and the 19th, where I say this day can be explained, and it was set to expanded, um, that is right here, this day where I said it was on active at one point, and then midday I changed it to inactive. And I also fiddled around with the desired and the setback temperatures. So all of these little tweaks and changes, and plus I also had a very high heat curve. Now, obviously, if you've got a higher heat curve, so I had 1.5. Now, 1.5, what was the temperature on that day? 1.5, it was quite low, 2.5. So if I go to 1.5, and here is about 2.5, look at the heat. The current flow temperature would be above 55. That means you're using more gas because you're trying to heat up the water to a higher temperature, which will explain why on that particular day the price was high, 601. And then, like I said earlier, whenever you make a change, it takes a day or two to reflect. So it might not drop the price instantly because it's still trying to figure out what the different settings are that have changed, whether you've set it to eco mode or standard mode, or the heat curve has obviously changed on those 2 days. But anyway, that's why it's quite high, even though it says expanded. It's because of that heat curve. But look at active, 610, and it's constantly running. There you can see constantly running. And look at all the other days. It's it's just better. In my use case, I believe expanded is the best option to be on. You can pause the video and have a look at this a little bit more closely, but for me, expanded is the solution. Now, maybe once I've confirmed in the next 10 days that the heat curve of 1.3 is the right heat curve, what I might do is then switch it back to inactive and set the heat curve to 1.3 and then see if we can lower the prices based on the outdoor temperature only, controlling the flow temperature, because I would only use that inactive mode, weather compensation, if I knew that the heat curve that I was on was correct to reach the desired temperature of 19, because that's what I've got my um, boiler desired temperature. And you can see almost from the 27th, which is only 2 days ago, I've reduced the desired temperature and I slightly increased the setback temperature. And what I've been able to achieve as well is I've worked out roughly based on this heat curve that I'm on now, that the time it takes for the control or the current flow temperature to go from peak down to the bottom, that's basically the length of time between the two timers. So you can see it starts at the peak when the timer mode starts, and it runs for the length of the timer, and then it drops off, and it drops all the way down to the start of the next timer, and then it starts and it goes back up again. And in that time, the indoor temperature only drops 1 degree or so, and then it starts rising. And we found, so also bear in mind, one of these troughs is at night. It's between 11 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning. Not that particular one, I think it's this one. So right here, it's 2200, and then it comes back on in the morning at 5:30, and then it runs until 11 o'clock, and then it switches off, and it peaks again at 5 o'clock, and then it runs until 11, and then it's off until the following morning at 5 o'clock. And I've managed to see that the flow drops off, and it drops off, and it drops off, and then it it starts again back when the timer. And that's also taken a lot of playing around with the timers. In these days over here, I had more than one timer. In fact, I had three timers. I had one in the morning, one at lunchtime, and one in the evening. And that'll also explain why it's a little bit more expensive on some of these days, because there were three timers. So that means 3 times that the boiler is coming on. The more times you have the boiler on, and then depending on what the outdoor temperature is. Now, obviously, these days here where it's cheap, you can see the temperature outside was higher, and then it got a bit more expensive when the temperatures dropped. But I was running 3 timers during those times, so that'll also explain why it's more expensive. Over here is where I changed it to 2 timers, and as a result, you can see the prices have dropped off, even though the temperature is quite low. So it's definitely, there's a lot of fiddling. That's the problem. And you don't want to be doing a lot of fiddling. You want to make a change and then give it a week. And the only way you're going to be able to monitor it, in my opinion, is if you have something like Home Assistant, where you can view all the data like I'm viewing it here, because there's just no way you can view the data in this app. There's just no functionality for it. So you do still need to use the My Vaillant app to make the changes. Yes, you can actually make the changes in Home Assistant, although I don't really like to fiddle with making changes to the heat curve, because the setting here is very sensitive. I mean, you just move it and it moves it in a weird 1.3112 setting. So I don't do it from Home Assistant, but it's possible. You can do it. Anyway, I'm going to leave the video right there. So I think I've answered the question, which room temperature mod saves me the most money? And I definitely believe it is expanded. Active, it's very expensive, and inactive, unless you know which heat curve you're on, it's the same as active. Is it more efficient? Expanded. Is it more efficient than active or inactive? Now that comes about with the cycling is a good question. I've got a screenshot which I will share on the screen right now, where I show the cycling for the 10 days. And I believe it cycles a lot less for expanded than it does for active. Now, I can't show you what it cycles for inactive because I don't have any data on that, but I'm pretty sure expanded is a lot better than active. And then which room temperature mod is best? Well, expanded is definitely the best for me. It might be completely different for you because of your setup at home. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. I'm planning to do a lot more videos on the Vaillant boiler as I test this system over the next month or two. I will see you in the next video.